Thanks very much, everyone. Can everyone hear me if I go like that?
Ooh.
Great, thanks. I'm going to be talking to you today about a program of research that I've been doing in the area of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a pretty specific difficulty that children can have as a result of prenatal alcohol exposure. And it comes with a raft of behaviour issues. So my area of interest is around behaviour and mental health issues for young people in out-of-home care. And that's what's led me to this presentation today. All right, let's see if we're... Fantastic. Okay, so first I just wanted to start by letting you know about some of the publications that I have in this space. Simply because many of them are publicly available, so if you'd like to learn more, read more or share it with somebody, that would be great. I've done a couple of products for the Australian Institute of Family Studies, so the CFCA Clearinghouse, an issues paper, a webinar and a practice paper. So if you want any of those, you can just either Google that or just email me and I'll send you the link. I've done some papers for lawyers around the issues of language and young people's comprehension of language involving the legal system for young people who are affected by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and what that might mean for how we explain legal concepts to them. And I've done some collation of, what's the evidence base around intervening and supporting these young people. But what I'm going to talk to you today about mostly is some of the work that I've done trying to integrate the knowledge base around what foster parents think is useful and actually helpful, and talk to you a little bit about a study that I did interviewing foster parents of children who had that diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So this topic today really has come out of a program of research in which I've really tried to work alongside with foster parents, and I've been very grateful to the participation and the involvement of foster parents and it's led me to sort of a new knowledge space that I wouldn't have had otherwise. I've done some work around reviewing the effectiveness of behaviour interventions for young people, for training foster parents in behaviour management. And what we found is, yes, that works very well for some kinds of behaviours, but there's a whole raft of behaviours that doesn't work very well for. I've done a study in which I asked foster parents what they found problematic in terms of behaviours, in contrast to sort of just asking about the behaviours that are common in out-of-home care. And that led really to this, to the realisation about memory, organisation, planning, language issues being so stressful for foster parents. I've done a study on the support needs of foster parents in which they very clearly told me, amongst a whole raft of practical supports, what they actually wanted was support from people who are actually knowledgeable, either were other foster parents themselves or actually had been in the system for a long time and knew it. And they often didn't receive that. And then I've done a couple of studies looking at kids' cognitive issues, problems with planning, organisation, memory, language. What's the relationship between those issues and feelings of stress in foster parents? And really looking at whether those kind of issues were more problematic than just run-of-the-mill behaviour problems. And in fact, we found that those kind of issues in children really get in the way of them being parented. Or they make it difficult to parent those young people, and they actually contribute a lot to stress. And I've also done a project which is funded by the Eureka Benevolent Foundation, where I have developed some resources that are specifically focused on the cognitive issues that underpin, the brain-based issues that underpin some children's behaviour. And for those of you who I spoke with yesterday, I've sent around a contact list if you want to be alerted when those resources that are free, that are going to be freely available and easy to download, when those get posted on our website, I can let you know. But if you'd like that, please do fill out one of these give me your contact details so that I can actually send you an alert when that happens. It's also important to record how many people actually are interested to give that feedback to the people who funded this project, because it was pretty hard to convince them to fund a project like that. And I'm very grateful for their support. Okay, so what is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is an umbrella term that covers a whole range of different diagnoses, and basically talks about the cognitive or the brain-based issues, difficulties with learning, and some physical features that come about by alcohol exposure in utero. It's often described as a hidden disability. We used to think that if a child doesn't have the facial features of fetal alcohol syndrome, they don't have any difficulties. We now know that you can have quite specific cognitive or learning problems without having those facial features. So often there is really no sign at all that a child has been exposed to alcohol before birth, except in their behaviour. And we talk about it being the single most preventable disorder of childhood. If you don't drink alcohol during pregnancy, there is no chance that you're going to have a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So why am I talking about this in a child protection sort of forum and an out-of-home care forum? I'm really wanting to raise the profile and raise awareness of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We know that for families referred to child protection services where abuse and neglect is substantiated, 70% of those have issues with drug and alcohol, with alcohol being the most common presenting problem or referring issue. So we know that a child who has been exposed to alcohol and is living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, when they enter the out-of-home care system, they're really coming up against a perfect storm of risk factors. So they have maybe some behavioural issues that are difficult to manage. If they are reunified or they're returned home, there can be ongoing issues with alcohol, which makes them difficult. Makes it difficult for those parents to parent in the way that these young people need. And it's probably less likely that they will be reunified anyway. But once they enter the out-of-home care system, they've got a whole lot of cards stacked against them in terms of experiencing a stable foster home, a stable family home life. So we've come to understand that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is really like a brain-based vulnerability. We can't change that the child has that brain-based vulnerability, but what we can change is how we interact and support that child. So we talk about the primary difficulty being, or the primary disorder or the primary outcome being children's changes in children's brain development as a result of alcohol exposure. But we can't change that, but we very much can control what we do about it. And so that's what I'm interested in, how foster parents can support these children. This is really just to reinforce this idea for those of you who are professionals here. When I went through my training years ago, and I'm sure it was the same for all of you, you were taught that when a child has these facial features, that they have been affected by alcohol in utero. If they don't have those facial features, they're not likely to have learning problems. But we now know that that's actually not true. Only a very small proportion of children have the facial features, the flattened nose, the thin lip, the smooth groove in the lip, ear abnormalities, growth retardation, things like that. And if you want some more information about those things, that's all explained in the issues papers that are publicly available. So I really just want to put it out there to emphasise, and foster parents still tell me that they go to take a child to a paediatrician and they're told, no, there's no issue with alcohol because he hasn't got the facial features. And that's really, just no longer true. We know that's no longer true. This is really just to emphasise that we're thinking of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder now in terms of the primary vulnerability. So you have vulnerabilities that might be that they have poorer short-term memory, they're more impulsive, they might have poor language understanding, they might have disturbed sleep rhythms, they might have sensory issues, sensory sensitivities, very disinhibited behaviour. These are all what we call the primary difficulties, primary outcomes, primary disabilities, depending on what language you want to call it. But then there are secondary outcomes that people talk about. So these young people are more likely to get in contact with the juvenile justice system, have poorer mental health outcomes, engage in substance use themselves, and so on. What we can do is, we know that a little bit more now about the environments that can support young people not to experience so many of those secondary disabilities over time. So it's really an acknowledgement that puts the onus back on us, that young people can't help what they're born with, but we can do, there are some things that we can do to support their development. Or to put it another way, this is my favourite little saying at the moment, that it's really our responsibility to create the nurturing environment. Okay, so we know that we know that alcohol is a significant issue for families that come in contact with the out-of-home care system or the child protection system. We know that children who enter the child protection system with who've had alcohol exposure in utero are likely to have some core difficulties that we need to work very hard to support them. But the other reason it's really something that I want to really emphasise to people who are in the out-of-home care sector or work in child protection is that we know now that it's really quite common. In the general population, people are recognising fetal alcohol spectrum disorder a lot more. We used to think it was around 1%. We now think in comparable Western countries, maybe 2%, maybe up to 5% of young people in a school or community setting will have been affected in some way. And remember, this is a spectrum of difficulties. But for children who are placed in out-of-home care, on average, across all the out-of-home care settings, orphanages, residential homes, foster homes, we think that around 17%, and some studies show a lot higher, but a really good meta-analysis shows around 17% of young people on average are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure, and to the extent that they attract that diagnosis. And in clinics where this difficulty is well recognised in North America and in Canada, in those clinics, amongst the young people who are referred to those clinics, so they're specialised diagnostic clinics, amongst kids referred to those clinics, some 60 to 80% of those young people are being raised by people other than their biological parents. So they're in the out-of-home care sector in some way, however that's constructed. So it's an enormous issue for us. And in criminal justice studies in Canada and the youth justice system show that around 20% of those young people have the more severe form of alcohol exposure. And it presents with a very complicated picture. Many of our young people have a diagnosis of ADHD, bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant conduct disorder, and there is a sense from talking to foster parents that a lot of these young people are really misdiagnosed. And indeed that's been, they've looked at that in studies where they've actually gone back retrospectively in case notes and looked at and reassessed young people with the knowledge that they have now and reclassified them. And that there's an alarming rate of false diagnoses, if that makes sense. Okay, so what is it about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that's troubling to foster parents? These are the young people that can have very disinhibited behaviour. These are the young people that can have really a lot of trouble with flexible thinking flexibly. They're not very adaptable. They can have trouble in using language to communicate and make friends. So the young person who thinks in very concrete terms, has lots of trouble with abstract thinking. So if you're talking to them about their goals like saving money or concepts of time, it's really, really tricky for them to understand. They don't adapt quickly to change, and transitions are very, very difficult for these young people. And that's one of the signs that we look for. Short-term memory issues, and foster parents tell me that not only they've got poor short-term memory, but what they seem to remember one day, they won't remember the next. So very variable, fluctuating memory skills. And language is an important issue for these young people, and it's really tricky to capture sometimes because many of these young people are extremely talkative, but underneath that they don't really understand a lot of what's been said and have a lot of difficulty with abstract concepts like metaphors or jokes. They take things very literally. So they get into all sorts of social difficulties because of that. And a big thing that our foster parents talk about is difficulties with sensory regulation, and they talk about this in the literature as well. Extreme sensory sensitivity, and foster parents talk about it being almost like the child has sunburnt skin. So they become very aware of the sensory environment. Foster parents become very good at reading the sensory environment and learning what will set these young people off, and very, very disturbed biological rhythms. So really not very well able to tell if, for example, if they're hungry or they're thirsty, and very disturbed sleep-wake cycles. Some kids are sleeping for 3 hours one day and, 12 hours the next, that sort of thing. So no sense of internal body rhythms. And you can see that, even if a child has one or two of these issues, it's a really challenging parenting situation.
So does anything work in managing that?
Yep. Yes. There are some principles, and so I'll just talk about that now actually. What I've done is gone to the literature around some of the evidence-based interventions that have been published, asking exactly that kind of question. So what we wanted to know was what kind of things look like they work well for these young people. The first thing I really want to highlight is that actually when Canadian studies where they've looked at the young people over their life course as they emerge into adults, there are a couple of things that are really predictive of good outcomes. One is early diagnosis, another is severity of the difficulty, which is not surprising, but the third is have they had a stable experience in caregiving. So I just really want to emphasise that because it actually is an enormous gift to a child if you can achieve a stable family home. And foster carers talk about being the brokers of the world. Foster carers really find that they have to explain the world for these children because they find it really difficult to often understand what's going on around them. So stable caregiving is one. And I'll talk about this in the practice paper that I referred to at the start, but I can send you, if you're interested in any of the studies that have been done in this space. Another principle is a highly structured environment. Foster parents use a lot of visual prompts to overcome young people's verbal comprehension problems and short-term auditory memory problems. So they use a lot of visual prompts, visual sequences to tell a young person what to do next, and lots of managing the sensory environment. So creating a home that is distraction-free or set up specifically for your young person. The other thing that I think people struggle with, and I struggle to explain it, is really that you have to, you cannot assume that a young person who is affected in this way will be able to pick up a lot of the non-verbal or subtle things, the rules of social situations, even things like, how to enter a conversation, how to leave, how to make friends. These sorts of things really have to be spelled out for a young person. The rules of the house have to be spelled out. The rules of school have to be spelled out. Are really taking abstract ideas and making them very concrete. Foster parents think that that works very well. And in the published literature, there are some computerised programs that you can buy that help because they offer lots and lots of repetition. And lots of repetition is one of the principles that these young people seem to benefit from. And so computerised programs are really good for increasing their working memory and things like that. Foster parent training is okay. Where it works best is where you and the young person are learning the same things. So you're learning the same skills at the same time. And there are a few programs that do that if anyone's interested. I can send them to you. We're on? Okay. So where I'm up to with this program of research is basically what I've done now is go to the literature and have a look at where foster parents have been interviewed or surveyed, or where foster parents have written pieces. What is it that they say? What is it that they would recommend? If you discover that you are now the parent of a child who's living with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, what do they suggest? What do they recommend? There's a lot. It's quite interesting to read some of the interviews. People are actually quite surprised to find that in reality they are the expert on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Not many professionals know about this, and if they do know about it, they're relying on very out-of-date information, generally speaking. So foster parents very quickly become the expert. They do a lot of research, and then their job is about how can they explain that to a teacher, how they can explain that to a social worker. So that's the first thing, getting support in understanding the difficulty and conveying that to others. What they also recommend is setting up your home as an environment that can support this young person. And that's doing those things that I've just touched on, and I explain in more detail in that practice paper. But providing a highly structured, highly repetitive environment, you explain what you expect of the child in very concrete terms, and you don't expect that what they can do in one environment they'll be able to do in another, because they need to learn the rules of each situation separately, if that makes sense. So I think I gave the example yesterday about if you tell a child not to steal money from Johnny's money box, it's enormously frustrating when they then go and steal money from Freddie's money box, because they've got that concept, but they don't understand that the general rule is we don't steal people's money. They just take it very literally that you don't steal Johnny's money. So use visual cues, visual sequencing, and being very aware of the spatial, sensory environment that the young person's being raised in, and what's their sensory triggers. They talk very much about your attitude, and I think everybody here would know about some of these principles: picking your battles, letting things slide when they don't matter. But very much they talk about the small wins, really focusing on the small gains, and taking it day by day. And a lot of the foster care literature talks about, the importance of social support. But what these foster parents said, well, yes, social support's great, that's fine. But what I really need is support from people who actually understand this difficulty, who are either raising a child themselves or a that rare professional that actually understands what this difficulty is about and how to support young people. And so just to finish, I want to talk about a study that we've just completed, and I did this with a social work honours student of mine, and I'm just writing it up now, and I just want to talk to you about those findings. What we did in that study was to interview by phone foster parents from Canada, New Zealand, North America, places where this disorder or difficulty is well recognised, where there are diagnostic clinics set up. And we talked to them about about their journey from becoming a foster parent and right through to the time now. So that many of these foster parents had a child since birth, and then some of their children were now adults or emerging adults. And so they shared their stories about what kind of attitudes and what they've learnt about how they keep themselves going in a situation that's sometimes incredibly stressful. And that study was supported by the Ian Cox Social Work Fellowship, the scholarship, which is supported by Families SA. So Families SA are doing some good stuff. These weren't Families SA carers, but they supported this work, so that was really great. So we really want to know, how do these foster parents manage to keep going, maintain optimism and support their young people? And is there anything we can learn from them in terms of their attitude and their mindset? The first thing we found was we were staggered by the number of diagnoses these young people had received: bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant, psychoses, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant conduct, a range, you name it, they'd had that diagnosis, multiple diagnoses often. We were staggered by the extremity of their behaviour reactions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We were also surprised by how much foster parents talked about the level of anxiety and fear in these young people. They were often extremely anxious because they knew there was something not quite right, but they couldn't articulate it, or they didn't know what they were kept on doing wrong in terms of friendships. And it was incredibly sad, some of these stories. That there were some delays in young people, but there were also some real strengths. So some people were really strong in artistic, some people were really strong in their friendship skills, and very much foster parents were really good at identifying young people's strengths. And we were staggered about how big a role the sensory environment played in young people, and how many medications they were on. Foster parents very much talked about their attitude as much as anything else. And part of that was around the grief and loss of letting go of what they had wished for and hoped for with the young person that they were raising, or they saw as their daughter or their son, and learning a different way of relating with that young person over time. And I'm just writing this up now, but it seemed to us that there were really what we tentatively call, like a mindful acceptance of the young person and their relationship and their life. And I think that these attitudes or these acceptances were, this kind of mindset was really helpful to foster parents, and probably to a lot of other foster parents who are dealing with difficult behaviours. The first was that things are just an acceptance that things are finally accepting that things are going to always be different for their child. Their child will never be like other children. Accepting that their life will always be full of highs and lows. There won't be a day that's not high or low, or many in between. And accepting that they will always have to expect the unexpected, that they will always be on eggshells, and there will always be a sense of imminent crisis. And so along with all these kind of mindsets, there was like a lot of grief and loss, but really impressive amount of tolerance and acceptance and determination to do the best they could for young people. So I just want to give you a very quick sense of what that was like for foster parents. While they talked about accepting that their child was different, or things were going to be different for their child, they found that people in society didn't have the same tolerance. They got lots of judgment, lots of blame about their parenting. There was a level of frustration because what they were dealing with wasn't a child in a wheelchair, it wasn't a child on crutches, it was an invisible disability, and they found that really difficult. And there was a mismatch between what they actually wanted in terms of support and what they got. Lots of advice about going to parenting courses, which was they experienced as really insulting. And they kind of learned that they had to do things differently for their young person. If things were going well, don't rock the boat. Consider that a good day, consider that a winning day. But there was a lot of sadness that went along with that too. And, over time they developed an attitude that, really that what young people were doing was nothing to do with what they intended to do. It was really beyond their control often. And that came, with that came an acceptance of the young person. They're always going to be a bit different, and there's nothing I can do about that except say, what can I do differently to help you? And that's just another example of really reframing young people's behaviour as not intentional. It's not that they, or as Diane Melbourne says, it's not that they can't. It's not that they won't, it's just that they can't do things differently. Okay, and the second kind of ethos or acceptance that they had to come to, that life will always be predictably unpredictable, that there will always be highs and lows. This really challenged their assumptions about that they were a good parent and that they had some control over their child. And over time, they basically gave away that idea that they sort of separated what they can control and what they can't control. And there was a lot of letting go of the idea that they could shape their child's future. And they really talked in terms of being able to go with the ebbs and flows up and down of life. And I thought that was a really nice metaphor. But also there was an acknowledgement that for kids themselves, every day was like full of extreme highs and extreme lows. And they learned that both themselves and the kids felt better when they had a structured environment. And kids were able to sort of talk about that because they were talking by the time we interviewed these foster parents, many of the children were older and they were able to like explain what it felt like for them as well. And finally, they learned the last kind of form of acceptance, or I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to call it, but you know, they learned that their life will always be waiting for the next explosion or the next walking on eggshells as part of it. That there will always be extreme reactions to anxiety or to whatever's going on for their young people. That it will always be unpredictable, and they're going to have to learn to accommodate that. Particularly difficulties with sleep was a real issue for these foster parents, that they, in fact, learned that they had to know their young person's triggers very well. That's an example of, you know, learning. They had to really understand a young person's sensory world and know what will set them off, and even then there will be unpredictable events. But the issue of sleep, we were very staggered by how many of these parents took it turns to sleep and had basically one member of the household had to be awake at all times to deal with this young person's really profoundly disturbed sleep rhythms. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, but basically I was just really impressed with the attitudes and the way that foster parents were able to persevere in the face. Some of the stories that we heard were some of the violence and the reactions of kids was staggering. And they came to understand, you know, that both kind of reconcile that their young person on the one hand was the most sweet, loving, caring young person, so affectionate, and that same person in the next instance could be tearing their, you know, hair or trying to claw their eyes out. And it was a real paradox that these foster parents managed to resolve themselves over time. And I thought it was really impressive. And that they were able to resolve that, and then they were basically, despite their grief and loss, were able to just resolve that every day they were going to do the best they could to give this child the best future that they could. So it was a very, very impressive set of people. So this is just to plug again. If you would like to if you'd like me to contact you when the resources come out that I've co-developed in partnership with a range of foster parents, please do come and put your contact details or email me if you would like to receive one of those papers or would like to receive any information about diagnostic clinics or anything like that. And there's my contact details. Thanks very much for your time.